On March 27, 1977, in the middle of a quiet afternoon on a fog-covered runway in Tenerife, a chain of miscommunication set two fully loaded passenger jets on a collision course in what would become the deadliest aviation disaster in history. No engine failed. No warning light flashed. No act of terrorism brought those planes down. What killed 583 people that Sunday was something far more difficult to confront: a sequence of small, human, completely ordinary decisions that accumulated silently, one on top of the other, until the point of no return had already passed. This is the full story of how that happened, told in the order it unfolded, because only when you understand every piece of it will you truly grasp why it remains, nearly 5 decades later, the single deadliest accident in the history of commercial aviation. To understand what happened on that runway, you have to begin not on Tenerife, but in two entirely different places, with two entirely different groups of people who had no reason to expect that their paths would ever cross. The first plane in this story departed from Amsterdam. KLM Flight 4805 was a charter service operated for a Dutch travel company, carrying 234 passengers and 14 crew members aboard a Boeing 747 registered under the name Rhine, the Dutch word for Rhine. Most of the people on board were Dutch holidaymakers heading for a warm week in Gran Canaria, one of Spain's Canary Islands sitting in the Atlantic off the northwest coast of Africa. There were couples, families, and, among the passengers, 52 children. It was the kind of flight that feels routine precisely because everything about it is familiar and expected. The second plane had traveled considerably further. Pan Am Flight 1736 had originated in Los Angeles, made a scheduled stop in New York to collect additional passengers, and was now crossing the Atlantic carrying 380 passengers and 16 crew members aboard a Boeing 747 officially named Clipper Victor. The passengers were largely American retirees, many of them booked on a Mediterranean cruise that would begin once they reached Gran Canaria. These were people who had spent decades working and saving for a holiday like this, and the mood on board reflected it. They were relaxed, excited, and completely at ease. Neither of these flights had any reason to go anywhere near Tenerife. Gran Canaria was their destination, and everything was proceeding normally until, that same morning, something happened on the ground that would redirect the course of both flights and set in motion a sequence of events that nobody in the air could yet foresee. At just after 1 in the afternoon, a bomb exploded inside the terminal building of Gran Canaria Airport. It had been planted by a separatist group called the Canary Islands Independence Movement, an organization that had been using acts of violence to bring international attention to their political cause. 8 people were injured in the blast. Airport authorities, uncertain whether a second device was concealed somewhere in the building, made an immediate and entirely reasonable decision. Gran Canaria Airport was closing until it could be declared safe. Every inbound flight will be diverted elsewhere without exception. Pan Am Captain Victor Grubbs, flying high above the Atlantic at the time, heard the news and made a specific and sensible request to air traffic control. His aircraft had more than sufficient fuel to circle in a holding pattern above Gran Canaria for several hours while the situation was resolved. He asked for permission to hold and wait. The request was denied. Every aircraft was being redirected, and no exceptions would be made. Captain Grubbs accepted the instruction, altered his course, and followed the growing stream of diverted traffic toward the island of Tenerife. That single denied request, that one word from a controller managing an overwhelming situation, was the first link in the chain. The airport receiving all of these diverted aircraft was called Los Rodeos, and it was not remotely equipped to handle what was being sent to it. Los Rodeos was a small, regional facility situated at over 2,000 feet above sea level on a narrow saddle of land wedged between 2 mountain peaks. It had been built to serve the kind of short inter-island commuter traffic that moves between the Canary Islands on small propeller planes and regional jets. On a normal Sunday, it operated with a reduced staff and light, manageable traffic. It had one single runway. Running parallel to that runway was one main taxiway, connected to the runway by a small number of side exits. There was no ground radar of any kind. The tower controllers could only observe what was physically visible from their windows. Within hours, Los Rodeos was overwhelmed. Diverted planes arrived one after another faster than the airport could manage them. Every parking bay filled. Aircraft began to spill onto the only remaining paved surface available, which was the parallel taxiway itself. Once planes were parked along the taxiway, it could no longer function as a taxiway. The consequence of this was straightforward and devastating. Any aircraft that needed to reach the takeoff position at the far end of the runway had no alternative path available. It had to drive down the active runway itself, traveling in the same space where aircraft would normally be landing and taking off. The runway was now functioning simultaneously as a road and as an airstrip. That single operational reality would shape every decision made in the hours ahead. When the two 747s finally landed at Los Rodeos and were guided into their parking positions, they ended up side by side on the crowded apron, their enormous wings almost touching, surrounded by the controlled disorder of an airport handling far more traffic than it had ever been designed to manage. Pan Am Captain Victor Grubbs made an immediate decision. He would keep all 380 of his passengers on board. The terminal was too small and too chaotic, and there was no way of knowing how long the wait would be. His passengers settled back into their seats, opened their books, gazed out the windows at the unfamiliar landscape, and waited. Grubbs even opened the cockpit door and invited curious passengers to come up and have a look, a line forming through the first-class section as people looked for something to fill the time. Nobody on board had any real sense of what was building around them. On the KLM aircraft, the passengers were allowed to disembark and make their way into the terminal. And in the cockpit of that plane, three men sat together with a problem that had nothing to do with the diverted airspace or the chaos outside. They had a clock problem, and it was pressing harder on them by the minute. The captain of KLM Flight 4805 was Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten, and who he was matters more to this story than almost any other detail. Van Zanten was not simply an experienced pilot with a long career behind him. He was KLM's chief flight instructor, the senior authority on Boeing 747 operations within the entire airline. He had accumulated nearly 12,000 flight hours over a career spanning decades. He held the power to issue pilot certifications and to revoke them. His photograph had appeared in KLM's own in-flight magazine in an advertisement built around the airline's reputation for punctuality and professionalism. His face used as the symbol of everything the airline wanted the public to associate with it. Inside KLM, he was known simply as Mr. KLM. The first officer sitting beside him that afternoon, Klaus Mers, had received his Boeing 747 qualification check just 2 months earlier, with Van Zanten himself serving as the examiner. The flight engineer, Willem Schroeder, was a deeply experienced professional with over 17,000 hours in the air. These were not men who lacked competence or knowledge. What would prove decisive in the hours ahead was something far more invisible than skill. The clock problem worked as follows. Dutch aviation regulations imposed strict limits on the consecutive hours a flight crew could remain on duty. The unscheduled diversion to Tenerife was consuming those hours at a pace that Van Zanten had not planned for. If they did not depart within a shrinking window of time, the crew would legally be unable to fly. That would mean stranding more than 200 passengers on an unfamiliar island, calling Amsterdam to arrange a replacement crew, accommodating everyone overnight, and arriving back in the Netherlands an entire day behind schedule. For the man whose face represented the airline's commitment to reliability, for KLM's most senior and most visible pilot, this was not an abstract operational inconvenience. It felt like a personal and professional failure of the highest order. Van Zanten made a decision. He would use the waiting time at Tenerife to refuel the aircraft to its maximum capacity, topping up the tanks completely so that when they eventually reached Gran Canaria, they could turn around and fly directly back to Amsterdam without needing to stop and refuel there. A fueling truck was brought alongside, and the process began. What Van Zanten could not fully anticipate in that moment was that the refueling would consume 35 minutes, and that those 35 minutes would alter the geometry of everything that followed. The aircraft was now being loaded with tens of thousands of liters of fuel, making it significantly heavier and requiring considerably more runway distance to achieve liftoff. And while the fueling was underway, Gran Canaria Airport announced that it had reopened. Smaller aircraft parked around them began maneuvering toward the runway and departing one by one. The window Van Zanten had been trying to protect was closing faster than he had calculated. Pan Am's situation was no less frustrating. Captain Grubbs was ready to go. His passengers had never left the plane, and there was nothing operationally keeping them on the ground. But the fueling truck and the enormous KLM 747 position directly in front of him left a clearance of just 12 feet between them, which was not enough for a second Boeing 747 to pass through. The Pan Am aircraft was physically locked in place and could not reach the runway until the KLM plane moved first. And then, without announcement, without drama, without any particular warning, the fog arrived. At over 2,000 feet above sea level, Los Rodeos Airport sits directly inside the cloud layer that drifts in from the Atlantic coast, a known and documented feature of this specific location. What at sea level appears as harmless high cloud becomes ground-level fog at the airport's elevation. One moment, the visibility across the airfield was several hundred meters. Within a short period, it had dropped below 100 meters. Then lower still, the control tower, which had no ground radar to compensate for what its controllers could not see with their own eyes, was now operating entirely on the basis of radio communication. The pilots on the ground could not see each other's aircraft. The controllers could not see the runway. The airport was effectively blind, and every plane on its surface was about to start moving at once. Gran Canaria was open. The delay was over. It was time to move, and the controller at Los Rodeos set out a plan that was logical given the severe constraints of the airport. KLM would go first. The massive Dutch 747 would back-taxi, meaning it would drive the full length of the active runway, traveling in the direction opposite to takeoff, reach the far end, execute a 180-degree turn, and hold in position waiting for clearance to depart. Pan Am would follow behind on the same runway, but would exit partway down at the third connector taxiway on the left, a junction designated C3, and from there make its way to the parallel taxiway to wait safely while KLM took off. Once KLM was airborne, Pan Am would move into position and depart. It was a sequential plan that required precise coordination and had a single critical vulnerability. Taxiway C3 had no markings. There were no signs identifying it. There was no edge lighting to define its boundaries. In clear conditions, this was a manageable gap in airport infrastructure. In near-zero fog, navigating to an unmarked exit on an unfamiliar runway using nothing but a paper airport diagram was an entirely different kind of challenge. The Pan Am crew began making their way down the runway behind the KLM aircraft. Captain Grubbs and First Officer Robert Bragg were using the diagram to count the exits as they passed each one. They identified C1. They identified C2. When they should have reached C3, the conditions were so poor that the junction did not present itself clearly enough to confirm. There was also a complicating factor the crew had noted. The turn on to C3 would have required an unconventional near 180-degree angle back onto the parallel taxiway, the kind of approach that does not correspond naturally to how pilots expect runway exits to work. C4, the next exit down, was a conventional 45-degree turn that made instinctive operational sense. The crew continued forward. They were still on the runway. They did not know precisely where the KLM aircraft was positioned at the far end, and the KLM aircraft did not know precisely where they were. Van Zanten completed the 180-degree turn, aligned the aircraft on the center line, and felt the weight of the moment bearing down on him. He advanced the throttles. Mur saw it immediately and spoke clearly. They did not have clearance. Van Zanten eased the throttles back without irritation, replied that he knew, and told his first officer to go ahead and request it. The exchange was calm and professional on the surface, but something in it revealed a deeper state of mind. Van Zanten had already mentally committed to going. The request for clearance was, in the logic of his thinking, a formality that would quickly confirm what he expected to hear. Murs radioed the tower and informed them that KLM 4805 was ready for takeoff and awaiting clearance. The controller's response was a route clearance, which is the standard navigational instruction describing the path an aircraft should follow after it is taken off. The headings, the altitudes, the radio beacons. It was not, under any reading of international aviation protocol, a clearance to initiate takeoff. The controller had not spoken the words that grant that permission. But the word takeoff had appeared within the transmission, embedded in the routing instructions, and Van Zanten, sitting at the end of that runway with his hands resting on the throttles and a clock running in his mind, heard it the way he needed to hear it. He said, quietly but with complete finality, "We're going." Mers began reading the route clearance back to the tower, as standard procedure required. He completed the read back and then added a phrase that investigators from 3 countries would subsequently analyze word by word. He said, "We are now at takeoff." In the grammatical structure of Dutch translated into English, this phrase was intended to communicate action, specifically that the aircraft was in the process of beginning its takeoff roll. The Spanish controller, working in English as a second language under considerable pressure, understood the phrase as a declaration of position, that the aircraft was at the takeoff point on the runway, holding and waiting. He responded with a single word that had no place in that exchange under international aviation standards. "Okay." He then added immediately, "Stand by for takeoff. I will call you." Those last words were the correction. They were the signal, plain and direct, that no takeoff clearance had been given and that the aircraft was expected to hold its position. But Van Zanten had already spoken over his first officer's readback with the words "We're going." The aircraft was already beginning its roll down the runway. At that precise moment, 2 radio transmissions collided on the same frequency. The Pan Am crew, still on the runway and aware that something urgent needed to be communicated, sent a message to the tower reporting their position. Both signals arrived simultaneously. When 2 radio transmissions occupy the same frequency at the same time, they do not blend into a partial message that listeners can interpret. They annihilate each other into electronic noise. In the KLM cockpit, the controllers stand by for takeoff, and the Pan Am crew's position warning collapsed together into a 3-second shrieking heterodyne tone that carried no meaning and conveyed no information whatsoever. The 2 most critical pieces of communication in that moment were acoustically erased at exactly the second they were needed most. There was one final chance, and it came from inside the KLM cockpit itself. After the aircraft had begun its takeoff roll, the tower contacted the Pan Am crew and asked them to report when they were clear of the runway. Pan Am acknowledged. Flight engineer Willem Schroeder heard both sides of that exchange through his headset and understood its implication immediately. He turned to his captain and asked directly, "Is he not clear, that Pan American?" Van Zanten, accelerating down the runway, did not pause, did not request confirmation from the tower, and did not reduce power. He replied without hesitation, "Oh yes." The engines went to full power. Inside the Pan Am cockpit, the situation changed in a single second. 2 white lights materialized in the wall of fog ahead of them, low to the ground and growing rapidly larger. For a fraction of a moment, the crew did not fully comprehend what they were looking at. Then the shape resolved through the mist into the unmistakable silhouette of a fully loaded 747 bearing down on them at takeoff speed. Captain Grubbs understood before he had finished the thought. He pushed the throttles to maximum power and wrenched the aircraft hard to the left, aiming for the grass at the runway's edge in a desperate attempt to get clear. First Officer Bragg's voice went out over the radio. "Get off, get off, get off." Across that rapidly closing distance, Van Zanten saw it too and reacted with everything he had. He hauled the nose of the KLM upward as violently as the controls would allow, attempting to rotate early and climb over the Pan Am before the gap between them disappeared. The tail of the KLM dragged along the runway surface in a long shower of sparks as the nose came up. The main gear left the ground. It was approximately 1.5 seconds too late. At 6 minutes and 49 seconds past 5 in the afternoon, the KLM's engines, landing gear, and underside tore through the full length of the Pan Am's upper fuselage in a series of simultaneous impacts. The KLM, its wings and engines destroyed by the collision, climbed briefly, rolled sharply to the right, and came back down onto the runway approximately 150 meters past the point of impact, sliding for another 300 meters before stopping. The enormous quantity of fuel loaded at Tenerife ignited immediately and completely. The fire that followed burned with an intensity that suppression crews could not overcome for several hours. Every single person aboard the KLM aircraft was killed. On the Pan Am, the collision had torn the fuselage open across its entire length. Of the 396 people aboard, 335 did not survive. The people who made it out were seated almost entirely in the forward section of the aircraft, the portion that the KLM had passed over rather than destroyed on impact. Some climbed out through ruptures in the fuselage. Some dropped from the wing directly to the runway below. One survivor would later describe the experience as a moment when everything simply ceased to be normal, with no dramatic warning, just an instant and absolute transition from the ordinary to the unthinkable. Rescue crews arrived in the fog and found the KLM wreckage first, burning 300 meters down the runway in a fire large enough to be visible even through the dense overcast. Every available responder converged on it. For more than 20 minutes after the collision, no one on the ground knew that the Pan Am aircraft was also destroyed because it was invisible in the smoke in the distance and the fog. The survivors of the Pan Am waited in the dark on the runway surface, some injured, some helping others, while the firefighters worked at the wrong end of the airport without knowing they were there. 3 separate investigative teams assembled in the days that followed. Spain, as the country where the accident had occurred, led the official inquiry. The Netherlands sent a team to represent the interests of KLM. The United States, through the National Transportation Safety Board, participated on behalf of Pan Am and the American victims. All 3 teams had access to the cockpit voice recorders from both aircraft and the complete audio record of every radio transmission. What they heard was identical on every tape, and what they concluded, while expressed in the precise and careful language of aviation investigation, was in its deeper implications profoundly disturbing. The primary finding was clear and unambiguous. Van Zanten had initiated his takeoff roll without receiving explicit clearance to do so. That conclusion was not contested. But the investigation did not stop there, because to stop there would have meant misunderstanding what had actually happened. What the tapes revealed was that no single point of failure, taken alone, would have been sufficient to cause a disaster. The non-standard language, the missed exit, the ambiguous readback, the interference that swallowed 2 transmissions at once. Each element on its own was recoverable. Together, in that exact sequence, on that exact afternoon, they formed a chain that the system had no mechanism to catch. But the investigation pressed deeper still, in a territory that the physical evidence alone could not reach. It examined what had been happening inside the KLM cockpit in the seconds before the takeoff roll began, and what it found there carried implications far beyond the events of that particular afternoon. Mers had hesitated and spoken up. Schroeder had asked a direct and entirely correct question. Both men had the experience to know that something was wrong, and neither one had pushed hard enough to stop it. The investigation named the reason plainly. The culture of commercial aviation cockpit hierarchy in the 1970s made it extraordinarily difficult for a junior crew member to challenge a captain, and nearly impossible when that captain was Van Zanten. He was the man who had certified Mers' own license. He held the institutional authority of the airline in his hands. To push back against him in that moment was not simply uncomfortable. In the professional world those men inhabited, it was almost unthinkable. Their instincts were correct. Their silence was not indifference. It was the product of a system that had never been built to let them speak. KLM accepted primary responsibility for the accident. Settlements with the families of victims amounted to approximately $110 million. No criminal charges were brought, as is standard in aviation accidents where human error rather than intent is the determining factor. What the industry needed from Tenerife was not punishment. It was an understanding honest and complete enough to make sure it never happened again. Before the legacy, before the reforms and the memorials and the global changes that came out of that runway, it is worth pausing to remember who these people actually were, because the scale of a number like 583 has a way of abstracting the reality of what was lost. On the KLM flight, there were 52 children. There were Dutch families who had planned this holiday for months, couples traveling together, individuals embarking on their first trip to the Canary Islands. There was a woman named Rabina van Landschot, a Dutch tour guide who had boarded the aircraft in Amsterdam and flown the entire journey to Tenerife on Flight 4805. When the plane landed and the passengers were allowed to disembark, she made a quiet and entirely personal decision. She lived on Tenerife, and flying to Gran Canaria only to return to the island the following day struck her as unnecessarily impractical. She chose not to reboard. She collected her things and walked away from the airport. She is the only person who flew from Amsterdam that day on that aircraft and was still alive the following morning. On the Pan Am flight, 53 of the passengers had come from Orange County, California, most of them retirees who had been dreaming about and saving toward this Mediterranean cruise for years. There were people from across the United States, all of them in the middle of what should have been the beginning of the best holiday of their lives. None of them knew that the afternoon would not end the way they had imagined it. The memorials came in the years that followed. A section of Westgard Cemetery in Amsterdam was set aside for the Dutch victims of the KLM flight, a place where families could gather and grieve together. In Rancho Bernardo, California, a cross was erected for the 19 residents of that community who died on the runway. In Westminster, California, a memorial was established in honor of the American victims. And on March 27, 2007, exactly 30 years after the disaster, something happened that had not happened before. Dutch and American families came together for the first time on Tenerife itself, standing on the island where their loved ones had died, for an international commemoration held at the Auditorio de Tenerife in Santa Cruz. On a hillside called Mesa Mota, overlooking the airport where everything had happened, a monument was unveiled, designed by Dutch sculptor Rudy van de Wint. It is an 18-meter spiral staircase whose steps appear to rise continuously upward toward the sky, climbing without end. And then they stop, cut off without warning, without explanation, in the middle of their ascent. It is called Stairway to Heaven. What followed in the years after Tenerife, in terms of concrete changes to global aviation, represents one of the most significant safety transformations in the history of commercial flight. And it is impossible to understand the world of aviation as it exists today without understanding what those changes were and where they came from. The word takeoff was removed from aviation communication in every context except one, when a controller is explicitly granting permission to take off. In every other situation, the word departure replaced it. This was implemented globally, written into the standardized phraseology that every controller and every pilot in every country operating under international aviation standards is now required to use. The specific ambiguity that contributed to 583 deaths was written permanently out of the language of flight. Route clearances, which at Tenerife were issued at the runway threshold while aircraft were already beginning to move, are now standard practice to provide before aircraft ever leave the gate, so that pilots know their full routing before they begin taxiing and are not receiving complex instructions in a compressed and high-pressure environment. Taxiway exits and connectors at airports handling commercial aircraft are now required to carry clear, standardized markings, signs, and edge lighting, so that crews navigating in poor visibility are not relying on unmarked infrastructure and paper diagrams. Ground radar became a required installation at airports serving significant commercial traffic, giving controllers the ability to track the precise position of every aircraft on the ground regardless of what the weather allows them to see through their windows. And on Tenerife itself, a second airport was constructed and opened in 1978, built at a lower elevation away from the fog patterns that made Los Rodeos so chronically dangerous, designed from the outset to handle the volume of international tourist traffic the island actually receives. The conditions that forced two fully loaded 747s onto a single mountain runway were never permitted to exist again. But the most consequential change of all was the one that could not be built into airport infrastructure or written into a radio protocol. It was a change in the fundamental culture of the cockpit itself. In the years following Tenerife, researchers, psychologists, and aviation safety experts turned their attention to a problem that technical training had never adequately addressed. Not whether pilots could fly, but whether they could communicate honestly with each other under pressure. The framework that emerged from that work was called crew resource management, and it is built around a principle that sounds simple and is anything, but that safety in a complex environment depends not on the judgment of the most senior person in the room, but on the quality of communication among everyone present. It teaches first officers that speaking up when something feels wrong is not an act of insubordination, but an essential professional duty. It teaches captains that authority and infallibility are not the same thing. It teaches every member of a crew that their instincts have value and that silence, when something is not right, is never the safe option. The training became mandatory for every commercial airline pilot in the world in 2006. And its principles have since traveled beyond aviation into hospitals, into nuclear facilities, into military operations, and into any environment where hierarchy can suppress the information needed to prevent disaster. Van Zanen was not a reckless man. It would be too easy and too wrong to remember him as one. He was, by every measure his profession had to offer before that afternoon, among the finest pilots his airline had ever produced. What the investigation revealed was not a failure of skill or character, but a failure of a system that had placed one man's certainty above the collective judgment of the people around him, and had given those people no real means to reach him when it mattered most. That is the truth at the center of Tenerife, and it is the reason the story has never stopped being taught. Every flight that departs cleanly and arrives safely, every crew that catches an error before it compounds, every first officer who speaks and is genuinely heard, carries something forward from that runway. The 583 people who never reached their destination on that quiet Sunday afternoon in March 1977 were not trying to change aviation. They were just trying to get to their vacation. But the world they left behind became, in the years that followed, a great deal safer because of what happened to them.